Thank you, Bruce. Again, I'm Tessie. I work over at CalStart, and I'm going to moderate our infrastructure panel discussion. So you already saw some of the things I'm passionate about, I like to talk about. So we'll work on tying all of that back in. And I'll start the same way as Bruce here. I just kind of want to go down the list. We have a couple repeat names, but maybe if you could reintroduce yourself, a little bit of how you relate directly to this panel that is for infrastructure, and what you offer, what knowledge base you can bring to the table to really help those fleets identify what kind of questions they might ask or to help guide the situation. So with that, I'll go ahead and start with you, Philip. I see you first on the list there. If you want to reintroduce yourself and tie it to how you can lend a hand with the infrastructure piece of the panel discussion.
Great, thank you. I'm Philippe Gerritsen, Director of Fuel Cell Business Development for Nikola. We are a pure play zero emission OEM focused on battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell electric trucks. And we're also an energy company building out the hydrogen fueling ecosystem to support a competitive total cost of ownership for our fuel cell trucks, as well as offering the infrastructure through which we would dispense that fuel to customers, both public stations and behind the fence fueling solutions. And we also offer mobile charging solutions that are quick to deploy and allow customers to take acceptance of our vehicles more quickly or use those for demonstration purposes in anticipation of getting more permanent infrastructure solutions installed by their local utility.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Philip. And I see Cecil, you are next on the list from AC Transit.
All right, Cecil Blennon. I am the Director of Maintenance here at the district. I oversee the fleet of 640 vehicles and 150 non-revenue vehicles across 7 facilities. In there, as we transition to zero emission based on the ICT 2040 ruling, currently have a fleet of 65 zero emission vehicles, 35 fuel cell, and 28 fuel battery electric buses right now. So transit fleet, so we do about 23 million miles a year. So we still have a lot of ways to go, but just happy to be here and happy to look forward to any questions and help out the team that's here.
Awesome. Thank you, Cecil. I think you bring something awesome to the table, and that's experience, right? Always helpful when we're looking for panel discussion pieces. Salim, I see you're next on the list.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Salim, the CEO of WattEV, and we're a company that's committed to electrifying the transport industry. So we're doing that by 2 ways. One, we're building out publicly available truck charging infrastructure, because we know that without the infrastructure, a lot of people have issues with charging, and we want to deal with the hurdles of putting out the infrastructure, dealing with the grants, dealing with the utilities, all of the work that goes into putting the infrastructure to remove those unknowns from the customer's plates. In addition to that, we started looking into the trucks because we knew that we can't just have infrastructure without trucks, and started going to all the OEMs, realized that very quickly that these trucks are very expensive, almost 4 times that of a diesel truck, which in most cases is enough to scare away most truck drivers. So we came up with a truck as a service concept that bundles everything together of the truck, the maintenance, partial insurance, and the charging to really remove all the unknowns and give the customer a very simple solution of the vehicle and everything included without any of the unknowns. We're starting in Southern California, mostly because this is where a lot of those mandates and incentives exist, as well as the demand. If you look at the Port of LA and Long Beach, it handles well over, I think 30 to 40% of the US transport needs. And you've got a bulk of transport that goes within the drayage industry to Inland Empire. So we've got several sites under construction right now, as well as 50 trucks under order that will get delivery next year. And then we'll be going live next year. So looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Salim. And Ian, I see you're next on there.
Well, Ian Hosteller with Electrify America. I'm the commercial fleet manager here. For those that don't know, Electrify America is the largest ultra-fast open network in the United States, with over 800 sites in North America, including Canada. We started this network in 2017, and it is really only for light duty passenger vehicles. However, the process of building these is very similar to how we would do it for medium and heavy duty. Last year, we announced our Green Cities initiative, where we're investing $35 million into the the Port of LA, Long Beach, and the surrounding area out into the Inland Empire to enable behind the fence applications, charging solutions for fleets that are going electric. We have multiple projects that are being worked on currently. One specifically, or a few specific ones are, we're doing one with NFI, which is 38 dispensers of 150 kilowatts each or more, with 4 megawatts of battery and a megawatt of solar, which is, one of the largest projects of this nature ever done. And if you equate it to, like, trying to think about how big it is, it's the same amount of power, or a little bit more actually, than the Empire State Building. And so it's a pretty large project. We're also doing a 30 dispenser site with our partner 4Gen in the Port of Long Beach, and then another 14 dispenser site out in Rialto to enable their fleet to be able to be, their 60 trucks they've ordered to be fully electric and help their Dreas operations. We have a few other projects that were in the works as well, which we can't talk about because they're not public. But the space we're very experienced at the light duty passenger public setting, and we're excited how this space is now taking off and how Electrify America can help with fleets, or even potentially have public stations that accommodate medium and heavy duties in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I see Gage is up there next.
Hey guys, sorry. Gage Kelly, I'm with ChargePoint, formerly Vericity. ChargePoint actually acquired our company, which is the software for telematics and charger monitoring. Now that we're part of ChargePoint, we have a lot to do with infrastructure, from planning, site design, assistance with scaling the infrastructure, selling actual hardware for heavy duty fleets, light duty fleets, commercial fleets. Pretty much an end-to-end solution is where we hope to present value. Where I specialize is helping agencies and fleets sort of choose and design how they set up their electric fleet, or how that may align with a hydrogen fleet, because we have a lot of mixed-use vehicles in our services as well.
Thank you so much, Gage. And finally, I see Tony Williamson on there.
Hello, Tony Williamson, Director of Compliance and Sustainability for TTSI. We are a third-party logistics company with a national footprint. We're in every major port, and that does include the rail yards nationwide. We are our Southern California fleet. We are moving to near zero and zero emission. We have CNG trucks, of course, battery electric. We're looking to, once hydrogen comes available, look at hydrogen. And we have a few diesels, but probably in January 2023, we will not have any diesels in our fleet here in Southern California. So we're looking to put in our chargers at a couple of our stations here in Southern California for our battery electrics. We currently have 10 Nikola trucks, and we have a project coming aboard where we will be running a fuel cell truck up and down the I-5 corridor in late 2023, 2024.
Awesome. Thank you. So you can see we have a wealth of information here to help from every angle of what infrastructure might look like. And again, it all intertwines. The sooner that we start thinking about these things as a whole, right, the easier it is to help set our project up for success. And I've project managed several projects where we don't want to think about infrastructure after the vehicle's delivered or after the vehicle's even ordered. We want to get on the front end of these pieces that can make the project so helpful as we move through the steps or the pieces. I wonder if I can have my slide deck back, and I'm kind of looking for Bruce or Steve for guidance here, just to kind of go through some of the pieces to bring the conversation together.
I'll go back a level, okay. Tessa.
Thank you. And so I really just want to take this back to the pieces so that we keep it around the infrastructure piece. Perfect. That would be the one. And so we initiate this kind of pre-planning and pre-permitting and how it relates to infrastructure and planning in general. So let's go back to the charger selection as we tied it to the EV selection. And then let's circle back to where we were with Cecil and with Tony, I think specifically, as you guys have some experience around this. What did charger selection look like for you? When did it happen? And was there anything that could have happened sooner to help with this piece? And I guess I'd like to start with Tony. I think I started with Cecil last time.
Okay. Well, our charger selection basically started in 2018. When they started talking about, the different type of chargers, we were a little blown away because at that time there was a lot of manufacturers out there with chargers. Everybody had their different types of connections and stuff. And so we kind of stepped back to see how all this was going to play out. Now it's 2022. We see that there's a lot of standardization, and we feel a lot comfortable with the charging selection. So we are going to be going with 350 kilowatt chargers. That's because of the duty cycle we needed to operate in the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles. We need these trucks to run split shifts. So with a faster charger, we'll be able to charge these trucks 2.5 to 3 hours to go from a state of charge to 10% to up to 90% for our fleet. So we looked at a lot of different factors on the chargers, and we have narrowed it down to a few manufacturers, but we're finding out that some of these manufacturers, the chargers are still 12 to 14 months out. So like you had said earlier about this process, you got to start out. It could be a year and a half before you can get all the pieces in place, the chargers, the trucks, and to be able to operate these fleets.
Thank you so much, Tony. And that's really the point that I'd like to drive home. I'll pass it to Cecil here in a second as well. But so I want to run down that as a practical example, right? And how that impacts your project overall. If the duty cycle for the fleet does require 350 kilowatt chargers, and you have, for example, 50 vehicles that you're going to switch over as you've chosen battery electric as a piece, that impacts the utility heavily, and they have their section next, right? So I'll get into detail, but as you consider the duty cycle and the battery electric vehicle, if that's the route you're going, along with the charger size, this is where pulling in the utility and the AHJ early really helps. And the supply chain, as he mentioned, or as Tony mentioned, is also stressed right now. So early planning is such a key factor to setting up your project for success. And as anything, right, that is an underlying theme in all of life. We want to set up the project for success to make it easier as we go through. And then I want to see, Cecil, if you have a very similar story, different story, or what that looks like. And then not looking for manufacturer or who you chose for charger selection. I am looking for size, because that relates directly to kind of what the impact is on the project.
Yeah, definitely. For us, we started with our pilot. Originally has a 62.5 kilowatt charger setup, a 7 charger setup. But our newest deployment that we have going into our two zero-emission facilities is a 200 kilowatt setup, and at 200 kilowatt, and being able to charge 2 vehicles at the same time. So really, I'm putting in 100 kilowatts to 2 vehicles basically at the same time. Why? Because I have a certain charge time where I have the vehicles down. So my duty cycle, typically my buses leave 6 o'clock in the morning and come back to the facilities approximately somewhere between 7 to 10 p.m. at night. So usually my vehicles are out 15 hours in the day, put in between 150 miles to 180 miles for my electric vehicles. Of course, fuel cell can go much higher, so we're not going to touch fuel cells because the range is a little bit more unlimited, but just to the EV aspect there, when my vehicles come in and they get serviced, then I have roughly about, you could say about 5 to 6 hours of charging time available, my charging window after I've completed all my servicing. So with having that 200 kilowatt charger set up, 100 kilowatts, I can easily put in back 300 to 350 kilowatts back into my buses. My buses have a 466 kilowatt packs. So they have big packs on them to allow the energy that I need to run my day. I also deploy is a depot charging strategy. So I don't own any right of way. So I cannot just go and drop in chargers somewhere, 30 miles away or 40 miles away from my facilities. I have to be able to rely on the vehicles leaving charge and returning back to my facilities at the end of the day. So with that, that's where our strategy comes into play.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cecil. And I know if we're just thinking about electrifying our fleets, some of these terms, right, kilowatts and depot charging, all of this may be very new to us. So I'll recap some of that, but I wanted to pass it off to Philip on the hydrogen side to kind of discuss just what hydrogen looks like in relation to these transit systems in comparison, I guess, to battery electric vehicle. Does that question make sense for you, Philip?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. So with the hydrogen fueling infrastructure, this is a new type of infrastructure that's being deployed. There was a question in the chat earlier about where are there existing stations today? And to be honest, there's not much in the medium heavy duty space out there publicly available today. There's a network of light duty stations that exist that have been developed over the past couple of years, both through CEC and low carbon fuel standard crediting mechanisms. But now today there's only 3 publicly available hydrogen fueling stations for heavy duty trucks. They're gaseous fueling stations, but we as an OEM and an energy company are looking to change that. We recognize that you need to address the infrastructure if you want to be able to put trucks on the road and have them get adopted by customers. So we are actively building out a network of stations throughout California to support the adoption of our vehicles. And through those stations, we're offering competitively priced hydrogen that can solve the chicken and egg problem that kind of exists today, given the lack of existing hydrogen ecosystem to be able to support operations of vehicles. It's not like battery electric where you can just tap into the grid subject to the interconnection requirements of the electricity utilities. The fact is that there's also limited supplies of hydrogen in the market today, and the cost of hydrogen at retail stations today that's being offered through light duty stations, frankly, won't meet the total cost of ownership for fleets. So we as an energy company are entirely focused upon how do we get this hydrogen industry to be flipped on its head, going from low volumes, high prices being offered by various industrial gas companies today to high volumes, low prices that can meet the total cost of ownership expectations of the fleets to help them facilitate their transition. We're doing that by producing hydrogen at scale. We've publicly announced that we're pursuing a hydrogen production hub in Arizona, and we will be liquefying that hydrogen for transportation into California and have it dispensed through our station network and leverage various incentives throughout that value chain, from production tax credits offered by the federal government, low carbon fuel standard credits offered by the state, and infrastructure incentives as well that help us pass those savings on to our customers so that we can hit the total cost of ownership targets required on the fuel cost and have it at today's diesel prices be cheaper than the cost of diesel. That is a far cry from where the prices are today. Light duty stations have been $12.50 to $16.50 per kilogram. So each kilogram is roughly equivalent to a gallon of diesel and energy content. And those prices have only gone up since geopolitical events with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Despite that, because of our energy focus, we are able to offer prices that are comparable to diesel today. And as far as the actual infrastructure required, we are focused on ensuring that we have a seamless transition from a diesel fueling experience with our hydrogen fueling infrastructure that we're deploying, with the expectation that we'll be able to fuel trucks in 20 minutes or less. I mentioned that, and if I can share the screen here, I'll show kind of what a public station would look like. So this is an example of a public station that we might deploy. For example, we've publicly announced 3 stations that we're pursuing, one of which we're developing with Travel Centers of America in Ontario, California. The other 2 are located in Colton and in Carson, so close to the Port of Long Beach, which we're developing as greenfield sites ourselves. With this station design, you have to account for a buffer zone around the hydrogen fueling equipment, as hydrogen is a odorless, colorless, flammable gas, similar in many ways to CNG, but with this being a smaller molecule, there's additional and have greater flammability. Safety is a paramount issue, and so you have to have buffer space around the stations or put in place protective walls. With our infrastructure, we look to have liquid hydrogen storage tanks, which you see here on the right, that allow us to then take advantage of lower cost electricity outside of California and distribute that fuel more cost effectively to our network of stations. So we're getting about 4 times as much fuel per tanker trailer. And we also have much more efficient operations at the stations, consuming about 1/6 of the energy demand at these facilities, because we don't have to have a lot of compressors and chillers to be able to get the gas up to the high pressures required to get the maximum range of 500 miles on board our trucks. Our trucks take 700 bar fuel. And so that is that is kind of the standard now for a lot of light duty stations, but it requires significant compression, which equates to a lot of electricity demand required at these stations. With going with a liquid solution, we're much more energy efficient and able to leverage the fact that you can operate a pump, which is more efficient, as well as capture the heat loss from that exchange from liquid to gaseous state, so that you can pre-chill the fuel going onto the trucks. So I recognize this may all sound complicated. The point is ultimately these stations are going to help reduce the cost of the fuel onto the trucks while enabling back-to-back fills that are going to be comparable to diesel fueling times at these stations that we're building out, and therefore offer a very similar experience to what you would get at a diesel truck stop. Because this technology is new and because of like the scale required, we see a lot of the applications for this being at public stations to begin with, and then looking to transition over time, particularly as fleets start adopting more vehicles, to creating more behind the fence opportunities for fueling. When you look at behind the fence solutions, it'll come down to what is the duty cycle of the fleet. Do they need to turn around those trucks for slip seating them so that they're operating basically around the clock? If so, you're going to have a similar solution to what we're showing here. But if the trucks just need to go long miles throughout the course of the day or have unpredictability, but still are domiciled overnight at the station, in those situations, you can look at slow fill applications with examples already existing in the CNG space, where it's probably going to be a more cost-effective station with lower CapEx requirements and lower OpEx costs for the power required for the station, and able to get the fuel on board the trucks. And in the interim, as we build out the stations, we also have mobile fueling solutions that can be deployed for demos and to be able to serve as backup for stations if there's power outages or equipment downtime, as well as for initial behind the fence solutions.
Thank you, Philip. And I want to point over to a question that's in the chat regarding delivering and storing as liquid on-site, but to be converted to gaseous. Did I get that right? So I want to just make sure you have an opportunity to answer that before we.
Yes, that's correct. So we do liquid distribution and storage on site, and then we go through a phase change as we pressurize the hydrogen for dispensing onto the trucks. And so we have high pressure gaseous storage on site that facilitates rapid onboarding of that fuel onto the vehicles. But it does give us the advantage in that as we look at the future technology for fuel cell trucks, it would allow us to support liquid onboard the trucks in liquid tanks that can facilitate much longer ranges with future technology expected for those vehicles.
Awesome. Thank you, Philip. And if we could tie this back to the infrastructure slide, that would be awesome. Otherwise, we can pull it back in and just kind of discuss it, right? So again, a major theme around infrastructure in general is that package deal. Once we start thinking about electrifying and moving to EV, we want to start thinking about infrastructure, right? Before we even get there, we need to consider what our route analysis and what our pieces look like and make that decision of hydrogen or electric. And I did talk a little bit about the investment towards either or both, right? They're two different technologies. Both of them are going to have longer lead times, as we've heard from Cecil, Tony, and Philip at this point, right? So we want to start making these decisions, self-educating, doing the research that supports finding this, and reaching out to utility and AHJs, and maybe finding somebody to help us make that decision of whether we need to go hydrogen or battery electric vehicle if we don't know, right? But it is a decision tree that kind of leads to the same pre-planning, pre-permitting, getting ahead of the curve in those pieces is super important. So that leads us to EV charger size. We heard, I believe, 60 kilowatt from Cecil versus 350 kilowatt. Again, if we run that down the stream, dependent how many vehicles there are, that's going to impact the project and how utility responds to the project. That's super important. And I'll recap here on kind of kilowatts and just a brief overview of what that looks like as we zoom out. So the battery in the battery electrical vehicle that you choose is going to tie directly to your route analysis that you are composing to figure out what that looks like. The charger then ties into that based on when you're available to charge the vehicle. So some important questions that we want to ask is what size battery, when we're looking at infrastructure, what size battery is in our vehicle? Is it a 180 kilowatt battery that would indicate a kind of smaller vehicle potentially, or do you have a very large battery, as most of them are modular and can just keep building, right? That then relates to how often do I need to charge my vehicle and where will I charge my vehicle? And then we can start pulling in all these other components for battery electric specifically to help us with that project. Hydrogen gets a lot more in depth around site location, right? Safety, some of the things that Philip touched on. And those are really important as well. So I'm going to move to the next slide here. The next slide is going to focus largely on that battery electric vehicle component and things that we often forget, like tips and stuff like that. And I want to make sure we don't lose sight of these because, again, setting up your project for success is super helpful later on. So specific to, and I have a hydrogen slide next where I'll go back into Philip, but if we're looking at battery electric vehicles and charger selection and accessories that go with those, we have some items that we want to consider, right? Cable management. Cable management is important for two aspects. One is that you have a cable, typically around 25 feet. We want to take into consideration the vehicle size if we're considering cable management systems within battery electric vehicles to plug into. That is, where is the port on the vehicle? And how long is the cable relative to where the charger is located? These are all small things that, again, thinking early on can help set that project up for success. Mounting systems, if you have a standalone unit that's kind of like an island, if you're getting a pedestal, software, signage, there's a lot of things that go into these components of charger selection that we want to be mindful of, again, tying back to that electric vehicle that you select or use and the port location relative to where the cable is going to go to. And then we have some other things, newer technologies, just like the hydrogen side. This is a developing landscape across the way, right? We have wireless charging that's becoming more prevalent. We're working on standards with. We have V2G. We have all of these components. And so if possible, I'd like to go back to Cecil and kind of talk about what cable management and mounting systems and what it looked like once you got your project installed into the ground, or once you started selecting this stuff to get the motion going to get projects in the ground, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So our first initial project was actually kind of similar to this, where we had it was a dedicated charger to a bus. But our new deployments are actually overhead, basically like trellis type setups, but still with a plug-in setup. The reason we did that, because on buses, we have options to do pantograph or type setups, but those are extra costs I have to add on to the vehicle, extra costs to the infrastructure. And then the other thing is just the maintenance of that equipment that's required. So we wanted to simplify things as much as possible for my facilities team. So we decided that we wanted to stick with the plugin setup that has been actually very robust for us. We have had zero problems with the plugs themselves, just making sure that there was no, even like if they were dropped by accident, they've actually fared to be very, very robust. So we actually stuck with that same setup. So we have a 26 bus infrastructure being built at one of my facilities, and then a 50 bus overhead trellis setup with plug-in setup for my other facility. So that's actually the setup that I'm going to say kind of standardized for the district right now. But notice that one facility is doing the trellis, the other one is not. So, although I would love to have the same things at the facilities, I have to look at my space. I have to look at the fleet, the vehicles that are running, and kind of work around what's available in order to do that. But they're all going to run, they're going to run the same chargers, just a different layout of how I'm going to charge the vehicles.
Perfect. And I love that you focused on two components, right? That is, when we start this, sometimes we find ways to improve it. Continuous improvement is so important as we move through and continue to phase in these electric vehicles. So what you first start with might look something like this, and you may move to a trellis or an overhead setup. One other question I had for you, Cecil, I wanted to talk a little bit, and I'll segue here, hopefully, as we go through the different types of services that we see in the charging infrastructure realm. But I will ask this question: do you own your infrastructure? Did you put it in, or did you work directly with an electrical contractor? How did the project site go? What did that look like?
So for the district here, we have a capital projects team. So it's all built or controlled by the district. And then we just put the RFP out to have the contractor actually take care of what the district has spec'd out. And we have 2 hydrogen stations and 1 electric BEB setup, and expanding to basically 2 to have hydrogen and electric at both facilities at my sites right now. So that's our current expansion here that's actually underway right now here for 2023 when it comes to both those. But we are doing also hydrogen expansion at my 2 facilities. So that's one of the things. I'm lucky enough, I guess, in a way, lucky or unlucky, whichever way you want to look at it, to have both technologies, expanding on both technologies as we're doing. So yes, it is a challenge, but can be done.
Can you compare the 2 technologies as it relates to getting the infrastructure in the ground?
So for us, I think it's important just for the group here. Since my 640 vehicles, we're doing a 70% hydrogen, 30% electric. So that's going to be kind of our layout that we're looking to deploy with our infrastructure. And the really and part of that, there's a couple of reasons behind it, but infrastructure wise, we've had our hydrogen stations 2014, as Philip was just talking about. We use fuel come-ins dropped off at basically a liquid state, low pressure, and goes through our setup. All our setups are liquid cryogenic pumps, which we can fill continuous. That allows me to fill my vehicles in roughly about 7 minutes a vehicle, which is really the same time frame that I take to fill about 50 to 60 gallons of diesel through my high flow setups at my facilities. So that gives us that 1-to-1. Space factor was the other item for us that we had to consider. And honestly, the charging infrastructure was a challenge with the trellis because we had to go to block parking, which we did not have. So it's a different layout for our drivers, how we operate, that we had to rotate, switch things around in order to make that work. Versus the hydrogen infrastructure, I would feel no different. It'd be really no different than how we handle our diesel buses right now. Really kind of transparent for the team, when it comes to that. But that footprint, if someone has a CNG, LNG, on site, basically I have the same footprint as that for my hydrogen stations. And with that same footprint, I can do 150 to 200 vehicles in that same footprint. So somebody earlier talked about scalability. When it comes to the hydrogen, it's much more flexible. When I've made that investment of, $13 to $15 million, I can fill 150 vehicles to 200 vehicles very easy.
Thank you, Cecil. That was very useful. And I'll pause for a second to see if anybody else has input relative to the infrastructure and kind of comparison of hydrogen versus battery electric vehicle in getting infrastructure into the ground or getting projects up and running. Salim?
Hey, this is Tony Williamson. We do have a project where we're going to be doing induction charging, where we'll have 2 trucks, battery electric, that will test for a period of 1 year of induction charging. And we are very interested in that technology because, you know, what you have on the screen, the cable management, mounting systems, this is all important because when we first started with the battery electric trucks, we didn't know any of this. We had chargers come in with the 8-foot cables, and we couldn't charge the truck. So this is very important. And another thing we found out is that drivers tend to, at the end of the shift, hop out of the truck and just walk away and not charge in, plug in the truck. So with induction charging, this kind of takes all that away, you know, the cabling and especially the security, because you know, these cables have a lot of copper in it, and people are, you know, if you don't have the proper security, they'll steal your cable and you won't have anything to charge your vehicle with. So we have a project that we're very interested in, and hopefully that it'll work, that we may be able to put on some of our battery electric trucks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony. And again, scale, right? As we scale out and these vehicles get larger, cable management becomes something that we really need to think of. So we offered 2 solutions that you heard of from some of our panelists on board. And one of them would be that overhead trellis system, right? Another one would be wireless charging or induction charging. So that's kind of what we're talking about here when Tony's talking about this pilot project. I guess the point that I would circle back to there are so many options available out there that decision tree of deciding which way to go at the start is going to help funnel your project into these different pieces that then pull back to still requiring coordination with utility and your AHJ to make sure the project is set up successfully. So if we go over some of the items or key pieces that we had there with charger selection, right? You have wireless, you have V2G. We have larger ones, right? 350 kilowatt. We have overnight chargers. So all of these come into play with charger selection. Components around the accessories are important to consider relative, again, to the port location on the vehicle. That is, where is this plug going to plug in, right? If we look at the hydrogen setup, it's a bit different. You have more of that nozzle setup that we saw with Philips kind of display there on the slide, right? So these are all important pieces to consider overall. And sometimes we lose sight of these because we walk in and we don't understand the scope of the project. I want to circle back for a second to where that leads in options as it relates to charger selection or what we're doing with chargers. So we have a couple people on board related to charging as a service and trucking as a service. We'll go into what those kind of look like or what those models look like in terms of providing kind of turnkey solutions. And we also have some areas where we can consider, if we don't travel more than like 100 miles a day, maybe a bump for charging, right? That is sitting and charging for an allotted amount of time to continue on your route as we plug in or identify more infrastructure needs for on-route analysis. So I kind of wanted to pause for a second and talk a little bit about charging as a service and trucking as a service. I have notes here that Salim has trucking as a service, and you also had your hand up. So I don't know if this is a good opportunity for you to kind of talk about what that solution might look like for some of these scenarios.
Sure. Before going into the truck as a service, I just wanted to go back to charging. Yeah, so when you look at, I think we could all agree that it's not a matter of if, but when the transition to zero emissions happens. California is obviously committed, as well as a lot of other states that are starting to adopt. But when you look at the early adopters of the zero emissions technology, it was most of the larger players that were adding depot chargers at their facilities and doing, tests with vehicles that are sort of outside of the typical diesel operations. But as we scale, we can't, assume that everybody is going to start adding depot charging. One, it's not economical. Two, utilities don't have enough power. Three, most of the industry is actually run by owner operators, which is much smaller and can't really afford that or don't have the facilities to do that. So that's why public charging infrastructure needs to exist. When looking at public charging infrastructure and what goes into it, there's a lot that goes into site criteria and how everything works. For one, the typical passenger vehicle layout doesn't always work in trucks, right? The trucks are much larger, they have a bigger turning radius. So, just the design of the stations is a little different from what a passenger vehicle looks like. Two is the charge times and the technology that we have. In most cases, 2 to 3 hours to charge isn't really acceptable for diesel operators, right? I mean, for them, time is money, and they can't really afford to just sit there idle and wait 2 to 3 hours for a truck to charge. And that's why, we're looking very closely at MCS, which is megawatt charging technology. So our public charging will all start with, CCS, which is the current technology at 360 kilowatts. And as the technology develops, we will add MCS, which would allows us to reduce the charge time down to 30 to 45 minutes, which in most cases starts becoming more acceptable. And then another thing that goes into site criteria is the location. So we're looking at, areas that are close to the end customers, off of major trucking corridors, has available power, and if not, adding solar or battery storage. So our Bakersfield facility is a site that is about 115 acres, of which about 100 acres is going to be all solar. Once that site is up and running in its full stage, that has the ability to charge 200 trucks per day. And that was sized based off of a typical truck stop. So we looked at a typical truck stop, how many trucks come in and out, and converted that into energy dispensed and scaled Bakersfield to allow for that. So that's in Bakersfield. And in some cases where we have excess energy, we may even add hydrogen. That doesn't mean we're going to install it ourselves, but if somebody wants to come in and co-locate our facility at our facility, they can do so by getting energy from us at a lower cost. So when you look at the hydrogen component of it, there's a lot that goes in, right? So a big part of it is led by how is hydrogen made. Traditionally today, hydrogen is made by steam methane reforming, which is the most cost effective, but it's not always the cleanest. The cleanest is through electrolysis, which is very energy intensive. So you still need energy, you still need the utilities to come and put in power to create green hydrogen. So you still run into those same issues as you have with a electric truck charging station, if you were to do it with green hydrogen. Now to go to the truck as a service side, we know that we wanted to remove all the unknowns of the charging. So we wanted to create a bundled solution that gives the truck with the vehicle, the maintenance, insurance, and the charging, and removes the unknowns. So we started looking at all of the OEMs and doing tests, and came up with a solution where we can come in and start looking at all these routes, where we're having all our depots, and working closely with transporters to identify, to prove that the electric trucks becomes viable. So as an example, we've got depots in Long Beach and in San Bernardino, which is about 75 miles away. And with the truck as a service concept, we're sort of removing the unknowns by coming and saying, okay, here's the charging depots, here's the road, the route that you typically take, and we know that it matches, and we can give you a bundled service all at a fixed price per month that includes the vehicle, maintenance, charging, and damage insurance, and removes all the unknowns from you. In order to do that, we have to offer some level of commitment. So we started looking at all of the OEMs and are doing tests with them now to really work out all the kinks. Tony, you mentioned on the last panel that one of the trucks went down and it was just a software update. We look at that and say, why was there a software bug to begin with, right? Why did that happen in the first place? I mean, if we scale up to 1,000 plus trucks, we can't really afford to call in a call center and say, hey, reboot the truck, or hey, this charging cable has an issue, come change the charging cable. So we're really coming in and understanding what actually caused those problems and how do they resolve them so that it doesn't happen again. We know overall maintenance will be lower on these trucks, but it's just a matter of getting to that point before showing that it actually has that case. Also, the trucks are expensive. So in order to justify the cost, we need to have more miles driven on those vehicles. Through Truck as a Service, we can identify the routes that work so that we can match it with routes that bring down that total cost of ownership. But in most cases, when you look at the owner-operators, it's not just about TCO to them. In most cases, owner-operators don't even have an accurate TCO calculation. Right, at the end of the day to them, they just want to make sure that their balance sheet is going up, that they're cash flow positive and not in the red. So having an expensive truck, isn't always enough if you come in and just give them Truck as a Service. So we work very closely with the end customers to make sure that we can give them the right solution that fits their needs.
Thank you so much, Celine. I appreciate that input. And as you can see, so as we're looking at charger selection as it relates to battery electric vehicles, we have different solutions set for us even within that category. So again, in the decision tree, another question that we need to ask ourselves is who wants to own the project? Who wants to own the infrastructure? If we have the resources available internally within the fleet to manage this out, then that's one option, right? If we don't, there are places that allow for turnkey solutions to become a play, right? And then we have to weigh out what the difference is and what the impact is to the project and obviously the cost. With that, I wanted to pause for a second and see if our panelists wanted to offer any insight into the charging as a service model as it relates similar or a little bit different to the trucking as a service model. So I'll pause for a second there.
Not necessarily. I didn't want to talk necessarily about charging as a service, but kind of piggybacking off of what Salim and a few of the others said about charger selection and how cable management and designing sites are very important. I think, Tessa, you mentioned that, ideal might be 25 feet, but whenever you start going up into higher kilowatt outputs, especially 150, 350, we found in working with our hardware manufacturers and really our liquid cooled cabled manufacturer who we're the first to deploy this nationwide, found out that actually 18 feet is the longest you can go for continuous high power charging. So, charging a light duty vehicle for 20 minutes at 150 kilowatts is not the same as charging a Class 8 truck for 3 hours at that level. And so the longer you make the cable, the more issues you're going to have whenever for continuous charging. And if you actually look at the MCS standards, they're recommending that the cable be even shorter, about half of that at 9 feet. And so site design is going to be very important. Similar to what Salim said, it's much different than passenger vehicle where you're going to have to look at, how you're going to maneuver the vehicles, how you're going to place the dispensers. Costs are going to go up because you're not going to be able to place chargers in optimal locations. So it is much more difficult, especially whenever you start thinking about the high power. Another thing that you want to also think about is interoperability with the vehicles. There's one thing to pick a charger, and there's one thing to pick a vehicle, but if those two things do not mesh, the charger and the vehicle might not work together, even though they might say they might work. And so what we do at Electrify America is we actually have a lab here in Reston, Virginia, where currently every light duty passenger vehicle that goes to market goes through that lab and does testing in the pre-production and prototype stage. And we're actually starting that now with all the heavy duty OEMs as well. And so whenever you're thinking about charger selection, you also have to think about interoperability and ensuring that whatever vehicle you're going to get is also going to work with your charger.
Awesome. And thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. So there are key points in there as well, right? There's just so many moving parts, and it's not in the intention to scare away the intent to electrify, right? Again, these are tips and things that we can look at early on that really help set up that project for success if we have visibility to them. So the intent is to share that knowledge and share that wealth of information. And again, now we have a not catch-22, but you have cable length as it relates to making it to the vehicle in terms of power, that is high power chargers. And you also have cable linked at the hardware side of how it relates to actually reaching the port on the vehicle and the orientation in the actual or on the job site, right? Two very important or key points to take a look at or consider as we're doing this. I'll go back to what Tony was mentioning, right? As we relate it to wireless charging. Wireless charging eliminates cables altogether. So again, self-educate, look at all the options available in addition to what's coming out in the future, and start making those decisions on the decision tree that'll help this project kind of move successfully through the channels. So I also wanted to circle back to a couple key components, and I wish I had a heat map available because I do see some of the questions in there. I did not add one here, but we do have heat maps available for hydrogen fueling stations across California and also for charging stations and what it looks like. And this is a developing landscape. I think in time we'll have a lot more of these in general, right? We're at a point where if we start the conversations and if we go back to some of these initial thoughts around project lead time total, right? If we're a year and a half out, the landscape may look very different in a year and a half. The landscape will look very different in 3 years. As we touched on earlier, this is the direction that we're moving in, right? This is the direction decarbonizing and electrifying is the direction we're going. So I think starting conversations and understanding project lead time and starting to build electrification into our business plans could help us electrify successfully in the future and help keep the project nice and smooth. I'll pause to see if anybody on the panel has any additional thoughts or anything to add. My next slide is going to go back into kind of hydrogen components. I'm making sure we don't want to lose sight of that as it relates to project sites specifically. So before we start here, I'll pause for a second and see if anybody has additional input or thoughts around the previous one.
Tessie, I just want to comment and just make sure for the team and everyone out there that they keep this in mind. So there's a lot of chargers out there, 200, 350 kilowatts, a lot of large capacity. Just remember that your vehicle cannot take 350 when it's charging. So just keep that in the back of your head, because that's sometimes when I've talked to other fleets, they're assuming, hey, I can go get a 350 kilowatt charger and I'll be done in an hour and a half. That's not going to happen. Their vehicles do not take that kind of capacity. So just be aware, understand what is the max capacity that the vehicle you're looking to purchase accepts, because every OEM has different standards. So just keep that in mind as you look at what's going to work for your fleet.
Yeah, thank you, Cecil. And that is a really important thought. So again, a lot of pieces, right? And when we start looking at what electric vehicle do we want, that's a good time to start considering what charger selection we want and how those two tie together and how they tie into existing building management systems if you have them available, and how they charge your vehicle. So again, how often do I need to charge is a very important question that's based on the route analysis piece, and then picking a charger selection from there. If initially we can keep the project size down, that is if we keep or if we purchase lower chargers, 50, 60 kilowatt, as Cecil touched on, and maybe we have 2 or 3 vehicles, you're almost guaranteed success through utility without a ton of bottlenecks, I would call it. And again, I won't steal any of the utility stuff, but starting to talk to them early and understanding what our charge need is. That is, can we charge overnight? Or do we need to actually charge en route at public stations? All of these things play into what the vehicle looks like and the success of the transition. So with that, I'll pause one more time. Any additional thoughts from the team here? Awesome. So if we could go to the next slide, we'll move into kind of hydrogen sites specifically and what hydrogen site projects look like. So I have the opportunity to interview often some of the fire marshals and AHJs as they relate to these projects getting into the ground. So I'll zoom out a bit and I'll take a look at the project site as a whole and some of the tips and pieces that can keep this project moving successfully from the start again. And some of the things we want to consider initially are that location. So location is super important when we're looking at hydrogen. I'll pause for a second and see if Philip has anything he wants to add to that, just because I know he works largely with the hydrogen pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that you got to think about what's the flow going to be of the vehicles coming through the property, as Cecil touched upon, as it relates to his bus fleet, and how do you make it so that you're enabling as efficient of a passageway for the vehicles as possible, while still being able to place the infrastructure in a location that has sufficient room around it. Liquid storage, for example, you need a 75-foot radius buffer around the storage tanks in order to be away from any kind of HVAC or other sources of potential ignition, as an example. Those are really important parts. The other aspects are going to be how are you situating the equipment that you're putting in place. These could basically be the size of a container unit, for example, being deployed at the site, in addition to, call it a 60-foot tall tower storing, call it 4,000 kilograms of hydrogen at the facility. So you have the layout of the equipment, which may impact on-site parking that you would otherwise be taking up if you're doing a behind the fence station, for example. For us, as we look at public stations, we really are focused on developing infrastructure at locations where they're going to minimize out of route miles and have easy access from the freeways, as well as being able to support as efficient operations for the vehicles in terms of ingress and egress, minimizing potential impacts to traffic congestion and so forth.
Awesome. Thank you, Philip. And again, so that goes back to location, right? And square footage, fortunately or unfortunately, right? Because we need to have those distances per regulation that come into play. That also affects orientation. So square footage and orientation is super important. Zoning and pre-submittal. Again, we go back to the running theme that we need to start talking to our authorities having jurisdiction and utilities very early on to get buy-in on these projects, to get movement on these projects. A couple other things I want to highlight here that may bottleneck or affect the project is open compliance violations. So that is something that could slow down how quickly the project moves, or how efficiently and effectively it gets to ground. So again, let's highlight those pieces again. We have location. We want to consider square footage and orientation, as Philip touched on. We also want to take a look at zoning and pre-submittal. These are very important pieces to get buy-in early to ensure the success of the project, or to understand what modifications need to be made early on to have minimal impact to the actual project. This is especially important in hydrogen. So if I were to zoom out and compare the two, charger orientation is important in relation to if you have a cable that needs to reach the port and how those vehicles will be oriented. If we talk about orientation for hydrogen projects, you have that in addition to safety components and spacing requirements that need to happen. So similar concept, right? And your answer to both of those pieces that need to come into a solution come from your authority having jurisdiction. That is your fire marshals, your building permits, all of these places to get that pre-submittal in early and have these conversations early on. Second piece I want to talk about is alternate means and methods. If you're having anything that's going to be different than what's in standard or regulation or code for NFPA and all of these pieces, we then need to submit alternate means and methods. This, in theory, will delay the project just by nature. If we can't streamline it to be oriented in a way that meets regulation, if we can't do it by the book, or we need to put in these alternate means and methods to meet standard or codes, then we by nature will delay the project. And again, we circle back to the same solution. Early interaction with your AHJ for permitting, and early interaction with fire marshals to ask questions. We interact as a team at CalSTART and Energize very often with all of local utilities, SCE, PGE, fire marshals, cities. They are very willing to help and educate and lend a hand. They just need information to help guide the project, if that makes sense. So reaching out early on, there are a lot of standardized forms at this point for best practices that can be pulled up. That is best practices for hydrogen projects, best practices for charging, best practices for permitting, right? You can pull all of these items up and self-educate and follow these forms as you reach out for content from these pieces that are super important. And I want to pause there. Philip or Cecil, I'm not sure if you guys have any direct interaction with alternate means and methods or what that looks like, but I wanted to see if you guys did to share any experience pieces on that.
So I think the only item that I would want to add is just public engagement. I know you kind of hit a little bit with, some of the helps and assistance that can be done, but I just want to show the scenario for one of my facilities where I have hydrogen. One of my bus yards located in downtown Emeryville. Our next door neighbor is Pixar Animation. So when hydrogen when we were gonna put hydrogen in there, you can imagine, a really beautiful neighbor that we have with state-of-the-art stuff. And here we're gonna put hydrogen. There was a lot of questions, a lot of issues that came up. So public engagement with your surroundings, your neighbors is a huge item that came into play, and making sure that everyone has good communication, understand the facts of actually what you're doing. Because as I do electrification, no one bats an eye. But as soon as there's something coming in that says hydrogen, people come out from everywhere to complain about what we're doing. So just keep that in mind. I think that's a big item for us that we saw and learned. And then just with our one of the items with our infrastructure projects that we learned to actually deploy them faster is actually our the local fire marshal was part of the committee team that streamlined the process, helped things move things really fast.
Yeah, I think that's all really good advice. As far as the community engagement, we look to follow the Justice 40 guidelines to ensure that we're doing proper engagement with local communities, with the local schools, the governments. We look to engage the fire marshals really early on, as they're some of the key stakeholders in this process, and want to ensure that they understand the safety around how to mitigate any kind of event associated with hydrogen. So I'll just echo everything that Cecil said there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, so again, Justice 40 is very helpful. Stakeholder engagement and community guidelines, right? And getting that buy-in early is really important. The fire marshal, I've heard on numerous projects, and those are typically the people I interview as I gather information to help with successful projects. But the fire marshal is imperative to these pieces early on, as your orientation may even change, right? There are pieces of your project that you may not anticipate need to change, but per regulation or code, they might need to change. And knowing that early on is super helpful so that you can reorient your pieces and your components to allow for this.
One additional one that I'll quickly throw in there too is if you're close to an airport, there's a lot of hydrogen stations in proximity or in the flight paths for airports, but this is something new for a lot of airports, and they try to get FAA involved, which can be quite a process, and we've had projects die on account of that. So that's an area where early engagement and education is really impactful, and account for longer timelines to get the appropriate permits, particularly if you're in a flight path.
Yeah, thank you so much, Philip. That's really helpful. And I'll pause again. I haven't heard too much from some of the other panelists. I want to see if they have any pieces here that might be able to add or be helpful in general. Awesome. I just didn't want to take. Tony, perfect.
I have one. When they're designing these infrastructure, these stations, these need to be truck driver friendly, meaning that the driver is out there with that truck, and he probably have a trailer or a container back there. So these stations need to be able to accommodate the truck and the trailer. Early on, when we were trying to source hydrogen back in I think it was 2017. We pulled up to a station, and we couldn't even get the tractor in there because of the canopy was too low. We had to unhook the trailer because it didn't have enough room for the truck and the trailer, which caused a traffic jam. Now we couldn't turn around because we needed hydrogen, or we was going to run out of hydrogen. So that was a we never did go back to that station. But when you're designing these stations, they got to be compatible to the tractor and the trailer.
And that is something very specific for class 8 and class 6 through 8 entirely, right? Exactly. Definitely one of those tips and pieces that might be overlooked. So, and I'll pause. I want to see if Philip has anything around that. I know as you showed some of the design for the stations that you had, if you had any input for that as we kind of discussed it a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's critical for us. We are oriented towards the Class 8 market, and so we fully recognize that you need to have the ability to bring a tractor loaded with a trailer into these different stations, have the appropriate turning radius accounted for, sight lines, making it as easy as possible by facilitating left-hand turns, and and all of that, as well as easy access. And we haven't really talked about this, but as far as public stations are concerned, your point of sale mechanisms and all of that also need to be developed and easy to use to help facilitate the hydrogen fuel cells.
Yeah, absolutely. And public is something that we haven't touched on too much, right? As we're electrifying fleets and trying to focus, I guess, on the fleet specifically, but charging outside or off-site is going to be imperative as well. So hopefully, as we expand and grow these stations, we can help that specifically, but for fleets too, electrifying and moving to hydrogen, kind of this decision tree of moving through is super important. So I think all of these pieces are imperative to again, ensuring you set up the project for success just with a good knowledge base, right? Knowledge is power. So with the, go ahead.
Sorry, one last thing to add that maybe gets overlooked with the infrastructure setup. From a safety standpoint, hydrogen fueling stations can't use the same canopies that a diesel fueling island would require or allow for, let's put it that way. There needs to be the ability to vent the hydrogen, meaning that the canopies need to be angled so that the hydrogen is able to escape if there were some sort of leak event. Additionally, there's requirements as it relates to having hydrogen detection and warning systems in place as well. That will help facilitate an automatic shutdown of the facility in the event of any hydrogen being detected, so that you are ensuring utmost safety for anybody that is in the proximity to the station. So I just wanted to add that in the event that anybody is considering looking at upgrading an existing diesel fueling island, for example, there's other considerations to also take into account with that.
And that touches back to safety, right? And I don't have the safety plan on here. That is super important as well. I think initial contact with the authorities having jurisdiction can help guide that. Safety plans, again, a very developing landscape as we build out, and these pieces and safety components are super important. And we want to start talking about them early. So thank you, Philip. That is really helpful information to have on board. Those permitting and pre-submittal stages, right? Again, super important. And this is a running theme for all infrastructure projects, whether you're going battery electric vehicle or you're going with the hydrogen fueling station. So each one on the decision tree has its set of differences or variables that need to be considered. We've heard from Cecil, who has projects on both sides, right? And he can kind of talk to what that looks like, or the challenges. And I think with that, I'll pause for a second, and I'd like to actually pass it back to Cecil and then Tony to talk a little bit about if you could offer one piece or one item that would help ensure the project gets off on the right foot, what would that be, or what could you think of? And Cecil, yeah, I'll start with you.
All right, I'll go first. Okay, so so the first part that I'm going to say is something that we learned is just make sure that you understand. Like for us, we use a lot of sometimes grant money when we're doing some of our projects. Is make sure you understand the full scope of what you're doing and the timing with your, at least in this case, was the team, capital projects and maintenance and what we're deploying, because I'm going to say we're ambitious, deploying multiple projects at the same time. We didn't realize the timing of the projects had to be completed within a certain time frame, which caused some delays in the projects because we had to go back and start the other projects at the same time. Meaning that, at least in our grant funding that we had, we could not, the projects needed to be completed within a certain time frame. The way the grant was running, it was considered one project, where we looked at it as two projects. So we quickly learned that we had a problem that we had to go back and fix quickly. At the end, that ended up delaying the project probably about 9 to 10 months, then running into delays with switch gears not available. Almost 52 weeks to get a switch gear. So really put a hinder on some of the things, but there are key items there. Those are, and I say those are things that are sort of in our control when we shoot ourselves in the foot, right? We didn't look at something, the detail, didn't talk to the other team members and make sure we all understood everything that was encompassing in the project versus things out of our control. I cannot change PG&E. I cannot change other items that I run into, but when we shoot ourselves in the foot, that really gets to me, because those are things that we should have paid a little bit, maybe a little closer attention to. Because I will say is, you are going to run into those PG&E problems, or whoever your service provider is. You're gonna run into them. So have a plan B. You know, I'm gonna say that our plan B is we have portable deployment for chargers. So we're deploying some small charging setups so that I can just charge buses, since we have delays in our infrastructure and I have buses arriving. So I got to figure out a way to charge that fleet, and I can't wait another year. So have that plan B just in case you need it, but most likely you'll probably need it. So that's my thought.
Thank you, Cecil. And yeah, so again, I'll circle back and recap a couple points that I think I heard there. One of them is plan for delays, right? Again, we're developing landscape. Those delays are going to happen, whether they're outside variables that might not be in your control, or cohesion, right? Making sure you have cohesion among your team and among all the groups that are going to be impacted by this project early on, so that you can identify those champions and really set out a structure that, again, sets up the project for success. And then a couple of the other components that you touched on, I think, are really important. Just because there is a challenge doesn't mean there's no solution, right?
Right.
We have a lot of panelists on board right now that can help with those solutions and those pieces, which is why they're here sharing the knowledge with you. But just because we run into a challenge, we have microgrids that can help offset some of the demand on capacity challenges with utility. Mobile, right? You heard from Amply, I think earlier, some of the mobile charging pieces. So there's solutions in development as well. When we hear about these challenges, don't just think challenges. It's more plan for the delays, so that you understand the scope of your project and the impact to the timelines, and make sure you understand that you may be looking for solutions to help keep your project moving, and you have the resources available to do that. And then Tony, I'd like to pass it to you to see what piece makes the most sense, or what really helps projects get off on the right foot.
Well, it's about planning. I mean, you have to plan out at least 2 years for infrastructure, especially battery electric and hydrogen. We've done a mobile hydrogen station on site, and it took me 14 months to get a permit, and they thought it would take anywhere from 2 to 3 months because it was a mobile hydrogen station. But it took 14 months, and that was, it kept pushing the project back and back, and then we had to go back to the grant administrators to extend the project. So Cecil, I understand what you went through, but if you just got a plan, and everybody, all the stakeholders in that on that project, they got to be able to be flexible, because there's things are going to happen. Like Cecil said, you got to have a plan B, A, B, and C. Sometimes you go down to E in order to get back to plan A, but you got to have other paths to get to plan A. Like we're going out for our permanent charging infrastructure. I got 10 battery electric trucks now that I need to charge on a daily basis. So we're going to go to a temporary charging system until I can get my permanent station up and running, and that might take 8 months to a year to get my station up and running. So we are mapping out plans, but you got to have a plan and then a fallback plan just in case plan A doesn't work.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Cecil. So again, as we're recapping, right, the common themes that we're seeing here is early planning, and don't expect, so we can't walk into Best Buy, order some chargers and walk out, right? It's a little more complex than that. We got to make sure we understand the scope of the project as we're looking at electric vehicles and battery sizes, and tying it in as a package deal instead of 2 separate units that need to function separately. So I think those are some of the common themes that we're hearing here. And then again, we're trying to give you tips and ideas that help projects run smoothly. I wanted to see if anyone else, Salim, Ian, and then some of our other people that we haven't heard too much from, what kind of solutions are out there to help with some of these pinch points if you have them available?
Yeah, I mean, as everyone mentioned, plan for delays and plan for higher costs, right? I mean, we're seeing that as well on our stations. But to the extent possible, there's items that are in our control and items that are not. On the utility side, that's a little more that's not in our control. But we're staying persistent with them. We've got weekly calls with the utilities and try to push them and see how we can get power there as soon as possible. And then on the equipment side, we've purchased those early, fortunately. So we actually have our EVSE equipment already in a warehouse ready to go. And we're looking at options on how we can get some of those powered up sooner using alternative sources of energy, whether it's battery storage or microgrids or through other means.
I think that's very helpful. And again, I can't restate enough how important it is to start talking early, start planning early, right? And understanding that the timeline you plan for may even then be delayed, right? This is a marathon. This isn't necessarily a sprint when we're talking about electrifying vehicles. Phasing it out may also help, right? So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, as it relates to vehicle delivery and coordinating charger timing and getting put in, leaving open capacity so you can keep building out. All of these things can come into play when we're thinking about how can we electrify our fleet. And I just want to make sure that we don't lose too much sight of it. It can be challenging, but how do we eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time, right? We just keep going through the pieces until we get to the end of the project and we can say we ran a successful project. And then Ian, I see you're off mute. Do you have some additional input as well?
Yeah, I think it is also managing expectations. It's similar, Rick. We've built over 800 sites, working with 700 different AHJs, 200 different utilities, and each one is different, but they follow a similar process. We've not had one utility move faster than 6 months for a new service. So if you think that you can just do this, as you mentioned, go to Best Buy, buy it and plug it in, it's unless you have the existing power, it's not going to work that way. And typical, it's more 12 to 18 months, especially in California, for a new service, and that's just for a smaller site. One of the more, and I think Cecil, you mentioned it, is switch gears. Those are all bespoke to the site. Unfortunately, it's really challenging to buy those in bulk, and they're all very specific to the different utilities as well. And so, when we first started in 2017, we could get a switch gear in 15 weeks. Now it's 35 to 40 weeks for a 4 to 6 dispenser site. When we start thinking about these larger ones, we're in the 50, 60, 70, 80 week lead times for these sites, for these switch gears that are very challenging. And so you might be able to build something, have the EV charging equipment, but if you don't have those important pieces, it's also a challenge. And especially with all of the new projects that are coming, like NEVI, for example, on the light duty side, you have all the infrastructure projects funding that is happening in California and which will eventually start happening in other states. Those lead times are likely to go up. And it's not just switchgear, it's going to be the utility transformers as well. Those transformers are now starting to see those lead times, creep up into the 2-year time frame as well. And so, as Tony mentioned, if you want something done, you should think about it 2 years in advance to ensure that your project's done on time.
Thank you, Ian. And I'm going to take a second here to zoom out and try to be mindful of our audience. Again, we say things like switchgear, we're talking about transformers. All of these are components that go into a electric vehicle project, and sometimes even a hydrogen project, depending on what you need. Primarily, larger projects are going to need the switchgear, right? Again, if we're phasing projects and keeping overnight charging mindful, if we're able to do it, some of these things help maneuver around those problems. But that's where good planning comes into play. And in relation to what we're talking about, these are all components that go into a project for infrastructure. The lead times, not just infrastructure, switchgear is used on projects across the nation for electrical. It's an electrical component or electrical hardware that would come into play. So they're not just used on EV infrastructure projects. And the supply chain challenges are in play for both chargers, as we heard much earlier, and for switchgear and all the components related to it, right? Those are things out of our control that we can't contain or control, but we can be mindful of, and early planning can help us identify the timeline of the project. Keeping projects smaller can help mitigate some of the risks around these things. And that would be by phasing projects based on vehicle delivery. If we're not getting 50 vehicles, for example, do we need 50 350 kilowatt chargers right this second, right? So these are all questions to ask as you're electrifying and to try and help coordinate with utility and AHJs to get stuff in the ground. And again, we have a whole section on utilities and permitting, so they'll help move into that. I just want to make sure we encourage early talking to these components and these stakeholders that can help make our project successful. And I also want to help emphasize that it may not be a problem on every single project. So the things we're talking about are industry challenges or supply chain challenges. They may not be to every project, depending how the project is planned and designed out. Hopefully that makes sense. And then I'll pause for a second to see if the panelists have any input around that. Fantastic. I think we can move to questions now. We're already 11:54. I believe we have a lunch slated for 12:30, and I have a few questions here. So I'm going to go ahead and move over there and read a couple of them, and maybe I can distribute them to the team to help go through. So we asked for a map of hydrogen fueling locations that accommodate Class 8 trucks with a 53-foot trailer. There is a filtered map that was provided and 3 truck locations. I'm looking at Philip, although he might not know I'm looking at him because I'm actually looking at my computer screen to see if he has anything specific for Nikola that might help with a heat map and hydrogen fueling stations.
We have not publicly put out a map yet of station locations. However, we have announced the initial 3 stations that we will be developing, which we expect to be operational by end of 23, early 24. Those first 3 station locations being with Travel Centers of America in Ontario, in Colton along the 215 and south of the 60, and near the Port of Long Beach and Carson as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And we'll be expanding from there quite substantially. So we have publicly announced a target of about up to 60 stations by 2026 for supporting at least 100 trucks per station.
Thank you so much, Philip. And hopefully that helps a little bit. And again, these type of questions are important, but in a developing landscape, more and more maps will definitely become available. So thank you, Philip, and for noting where those projects are, and many more projects will be going up. Well, I have you on the line. We are asking to expand on the cost of hydrogen per gallon. Is that something? So you talked a little bit about that. Maybe if we can draw back and highlight the key components or pieces and what it looks like 3 years from now, 5 years from now, as you kind of emphasize movement in a positive direction.
Yeah. So if you look at retail prices today, it's $12.50 to $16.50 at many of the light duty stations, or even the heavy duty stations that are currently available. If you come up and get retail fuel pricing, and some of those prices have increased over $20 a kilogram. So think $20 a gallon. By comparison, we are making significant capital investments, hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, into the infrastructure to support cost-effective hydrogen. That is, we expect to be able to produce and deliver to our customers under our bundled lease, is what we call it, where we basically sell the truck or lease it and have the fuel supply also offered to our customers, where the fuel, truck, and service would be competitive from a total cost of ownership with a diesel truck, meaning you're basically going to have hydrogen fuel around or below the cost of diesel at today's retail rates. So we offer that to our Nikola customers, and expect to be able to offer through our public station network access to support other OEMs vehicles coming to those stations. We encourage the discussions with other OEMs to be able to offer their customers discounted fuel pricing. One of the reasons that we have our bundled lease offer is so that we can get assurance of demand for the significant capital investments we have to make on the infrastructure, but that allows us to then be able to offer these substantially lower prices, because we're not having to take as much development risk in the development of these solutions, so that we can ultimately build out that competitive total cost of ownership and help get more zero emission trucks into the market.
Thank you, Philip. And I'll zoom out and just say again, hydrogen is probably one of the highly developing landscapes that's coming to light, right? The methods and ways we create hydrogen, how we sell them, how we transport them. So I agree that in 3-5 years time, I don't think hydrogen would be where it's at now necessarily, and access to it I do believe would also be a lot more. So hopefully that helps answer a little bit of content around that question. Again, we do the best that we can to answer these questions within the landscape we're in and the environment that's dynamic and fluid, right?
Yeah, and just to expound upon that, I mean, from our perspective, we're looking to provide the lowest CI hydrogen possible, and that allows us to maximize things like production tax credits and low carbon fuel standard credits. But cost of equipment is higher in the early stages of where the market is today. But we expect those hydrogen fuel prices to decline over time as a result of economies of scale being realized throughout the hydrogen value chain, as well as the continued development of the hydrogen ecosystem as a whole as a result of bills such as the Inflation Reduction Act, the DOE's Hydrogen Hub efforts, which is targeting $1 per kilogram of hydrogen at the production site. So all of that will translate to hydrogen becoming more and more cost effective over time, and not having to lean as much upon incentives to help make it cost effective for fleets in places like California.
Tessa, if I can add, just because I think, I think for all the fleet owners, everyone wants to know, because we're used to CPM. What does it translate in the CPM world for us? That's what I have to manage, right, as it comes to that. So just to give the group, for comparison to my diesel fleet, to my hydrogen vehicles, I run my own stations, everything on site. At the pump, not including any kind of credits and LCFS stuff that you may do or may not do, and sort of that. So just straight line across, apples to apple comparison. Basically, in my cost, I see my fuel is basically, when it comes to labor, they're pretty standard across my diesel and my zero emission vehicles. But when it comes to hydrogen, I have about $1 more cost per mile when it comes to my hydrogen vehicles. My CPM for my diesel vehicles, roughly for my fuel, roughly right now, especially with the rising cost of fuel that we've had to deal with, diesel, has climbed up. So I see about a 75 cents when it comes to that. So the difference where we see as my fleet is I need hydrogen to be around $5 a kilogram to be diesel parity for my fleet to how I operate. So hopefully that gives a little bit more for some of the folks out there. But my diesel fleet's usually running somewhere like 1.6 with the current cost, and my hydrogens are running about 2.15 right now. So that should help out some of those.
Thank you, Cecil. And that actually has me segue to the next question, which I had in mind for you already. And so we have a comment regarding the investment into infrastructure as competing technologies. And I'm not sure I agree with the competing technologies part. So I wanted to expand slightly on that. I think that both battery electric vehicle and hydrogen have their place. Hydrogen, as it relates, as more studies show, closer to the larger vehicles, the Class 8, the larger ones, there's an opportunity there. And battery electric, as it would relate more to not smaller vehicles, but to a specific set of duty cycles that are built in. So I wanted to pause, Cecil, and ask you, as having both infrastructure and both available technologies, do you think these are competing technologies? Did you select both as competing technologies, or what were your thoughts around choosing between hydrogen and battery electric vehicles, if that makes sense?
So honestly, I didn't say that I had a choice, but we deployed both. One, because we've been running hydrogen since early 2003. We, as batteries have developed, the battery density has increased. Early on, as they mentioned, 50-mile range. Now you got 300-mile range on some buses, depending on how many batteries you put on them. So for us, we wanted to really to be able to give my board an informed decision based on facts in our environment. So honestly, that's where it came from. So in 2018 is where we received our first group of battery electric buses that we started to compare and started doing analysis of, what we deployed, what we call the 5x5, where we're comparing 5 different 25 total vehicles and comparing the different technologies on the same routes and how learning from them. So we basically deployed our own analysis to make informed decisions. Now, in there, we also have the set parameters for our own operating. Electric vehicles, hands down, cannot keep that same range as the fuel cell right now, but you can add more batteries. But as you add more batteries, that cost of that vehicle then comes closer to the cost of a fuel cell, because my fuel cell vehicles are more expensive when I buy my buses. And I'm talking about buses technology, so that when everyone understands the pricing that I'm referring to is bus technology. So my buses run about $1.2 million for one 40-foot bus. A electric bus runs about $950,000, just shy of $1 million. So I have about a $200,000 price difference when it comes to that. And then when I add more batteries, I do get more range on a battery electric bus. But now I come into the cost range of a fuel cell. So why do a battery electric bus if I can now get 300 miles for and not change my operation? Somebody earlier mentioned about, you have your layout, you have the flow of your traffic, you have the process with your team. And if you don't have to change that operational success or I say that's been grandfathered in, that everybody knows, that's repetitive, that everybody knows what to do, and you don't have to change that. Sometimes that's a huge benefit, because also someone talked about is, what is that electric vehicle doesn't get plugged in? Now you don't have a vehicle ready for the next day. So in transit is probably very different in some of the other fleets that are on here. But in there's 4 items that really determine for us, how we use our technologies. One is range. Okay. So for me, typically anything under 150 miles, I'm more than comfortable to run one of my battery electric buses. Anything above 150 miles, it's fuel cell or diesel hybrid, or one of the other technologies that we run. So there's a clear set that we performed analysis and decided where that threshold is, regardless of climate. Okay. That's the other item. It doesn't matter if it's cold weather. My electric buses can do that 150-mile run, no problem. So that we're covered in that aspect. Our energy provider, if I have an issue with the energy provider, PG&E, one of my facilities is in a zone where it has the power shutoffs, I may lose electricity, and happens during hot time frames. I may not be able to charge, vehicles. So I have to think twice whether I'm going to deploy electric vehicles at that facility or just do hydrogen, because I don't have a problem when electricity goes out, my diesel generators come online, and I can fill hydrogen without any issues when it comes to that. So, that kind of strategy is huge for us. And then also our board direction, for the business, we are not going to change our service profile to the technology. The technology needs to meet the service profile, because I can't tell a passenger to get off halfway on a route because my vehicles can't do that and then transfer to another vehicle. So that would kill my service, So there's key elements that we looked at as a business entity and decided that these are must in our technology deployment. And that's part of the path that we picked.
Thank you so much, Cecil. Tony, did you have any additional input or any thoughts around, I heard you talk about wireless technology as innovative solutions, right? Hydrogen as well. But I guess the question is, do you view these as competing technologies, or do you see kind of like what Cecil's saying, there's a threshold or cutoff where there's an opportunity for both dependent on business case or duty cycle?
Yeah, for us, it depends on the duty cycle. We don't see them as competing. We see them basically as complementary. Forest drayage, that's one of our core business. We see the battery electric trucks working. Like we've been running the Nikola trucks. Those have a range of 300 miles for you have to charge them. And we have ran those trucks up to about 260 miles with no issues. So they'll work in our drayage. We also have medium to long haul. Now, we know that we can't run the battery electric trucks there, but we could run the hydrogen fuel cell as long as we have the infrastructure to fill those trucks. Because like I said earlier, the fuel cell truck will feel just like a diesel truck. 20, 25 minutes, and that driver can go another 500 miles. So we see these as complementary as opposed to competing technology.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate that. And I just want to emphasize that I don't believe either of these opportunities disappear or fade into nothing, right? There are business cases and there are opportunities for both, right? Figuring out which best fits your duty cycle or business case is the imperative part of that start of the decision tree as we branch into how to set up a project successfully, if that makes sense. And I have another question here. I wanted to pause and see if any of the other panelists have input on that last question before I move on now.
Yeah, I'll just say at Nikola, we have both battery electric and fuel cell trucks, and exactly what Tony stated. It's about what's the right duty cycle for each application and what do your operations look like. Battery electric being better for the shorter haul return to base type operations or regular routes. Fuel cell electric having greater flexibility, but a little bit of a higher operating cost associated with it compared to the battery electric trucks. So both have their fit, which is why we see both of those having a place in our product portfolio through the future.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Tony. And thank you, Cecil. And our next question here is going to be in terms of planning considerations for fleets in rural California that are primarily off-highway vehicles. So in general, project scope, as identified by that kind of guideline that we started initially, applies to all projects. So reaching out to utility and your AHJ is probably a pretty good start to figure out what existing capacity looks like and how that relates to your charger size and your vehicles. The duty cycle that is being referenced here also comes into play, right? So even though it's in a rural area, your capacity may be smaller. We may need to look at solutions more closely around microgrids, solar or battery storage. But in general, the project flow would be the same. And I'll pause there to see if any of the panelists have anything specific to that. I thought I heard some port information or somewhere around there, but Salim, I see you're off of.
Yeah, I think one thing just to add on that would be environmental as well. So that plays a big role and can also affect the project timeline, right? So if a project is just dirt and hasn't had any environmental studies done on it, that alone can be almost a year process. And then again, as you mentioned, utilities start the conversations early, see how much power is available. If there isn't enough power, is a microgrid or battery storage a solution? And also how long does it take to upgrade the lines if you want to have utilities there?
And then Tony, I see you're still off mute. Did you have anything to add to that?
No, not that question. I am curious. They said rural. I wish that could be defined. What they mean by rural. Is it rural based off of how many miles they have to travel for that service, or there's no service where they're located?
That's a good question. So there's different funnels, right, that it could go into. We have agriculture, we have forklifts. I mean, off-highway vehicles as it relates to rural could go in many things. So we can see if we get follow-up on that piece or that part in particular. So we have another question here. Can we address the effects on battery life with increasingly higher charging rate? How much more quickly will the battery deteriorate? And I heard Cecil talk a little bit about this, so I'll pass it off. We're also at 12:12 and we have a few more questions to get through, so I don't want to steal too much here. But Cecil, you talked a little bit about battery charging, not accepting 350 kilowatt charge, which is absolutely correct and dependent on the vehicle and OEM. And then the deterioration, I heard some things that affect that as you were speaking around weather, temperature, where you're located, right? If you're running the AC, if it's a cold morning. So I believe that's what they're asking. I'm trying to go through this here, but I'll read it one more time before I pass it off. Can you address the effects on battery life with increasingly higher charging rate, and how much more quickly will the battery deteriorate?
So I think the question is actually geared towards if I'm, like right now I charge the 62 kilowatt, but I can put daisy chain the charger, so they'll do 125, and I'm charging 125 basically all day long on my buses. They run that 15-hour time frame, so I'm putting back in, let's just say 300 kilowatts out of that 466. What I want to highlight, I think, is to answer that question is I don't charge at high capacity. I would say high capacity of 200 kilowatts. So I cannot speak of really degradation. And I don't think that anybody can right now, because there's no one that I know of, and the many agencies that I talk to or folks out there that have ZEDs that are charging at that rate right now consistently. What I think the biggest factor, and the battery manufacturers will say, is that is your charging profile. How you leave that vehicle charged. If you charge that vehicle to full capacity and leave it parked for 3-4 days, that's going to be an issue. When you charge that vehicle, how far down do you use the batteries? That's also going to be a bigger impact. So I think those two items, the battery manufacturer will tell you, those will be the two biggest things that you probably need to consider, and not so much how much the vehicle charges at. And I say that because just like natural gas, the battery electric vehicles also work in the same format. You will have a, let's say 200 kilowatt charger. It's going to fast charge, let's say 180 right away, and then it's going to slow down towards the end of whatever the period that your vehicle is charging. So it's not going to be receiving all that battery, all that energy at the same time. The BMS is not going to allow it to go past whatever thresholds are set up by the OEM. So there are parameters that the OEMs have set, which we have some here, which they can, comment on, to make sure that their batteries are, I'm going to say, maintained in a healthy life cycle to meet a certain life expectancy that that's agreed upon there, or what they're trying to do. So I think the profile is what's more important and the usage on how far you get your vehicles go down. So, like example for us, we charge to 93% capacity. That's what the OEM allows me to, and I go down to roughly about 20%. Okay, of my battery. That's my normal day's usage for my vehicle. Sometimes they come down at 15, sometimes they're up in the 25. A little bit depends on the driver and the weather, and the route that it goes to. But typically I'm okay. 93% full charge to 20% is what I want to see my vehicles coming in. And I plan, at least in the aspect, I will let you guys know in many years from now, how the batteries perform, because a lot of this has not been proven. A lot of this is still new, and I am pushing a lot of the OEMs that I deal with on my fleets to the max. I need to be able to have a transit bus that does 40,000 plus miles in a year. So I need to be able to get that same type of service out of a electric vehicle. So if I only run an electric vehicle 100 miles a day, it will never be a one-to-one comparison to a diesel bus. So I must see at least 150 miles every single day in order to really say that I have a one-to-one comparison when it comes to transit. So I hope that kind of puts a lot out there for you guys.
Thank you, Cecil. And then I wanted to take an opportunity to pass it to our charger specialists, as well as I view Celine and Ian there, to see if they have input on the charging. I can reread the question again as well, if it's helpful.
Sure. Yeah. So just to add on to that, I mean, we try to be OEM agnostic as well, both on the truck manufacturers and chargers, but we'll be collecting all of that data through our truck as a service operations to really see how the truck performs through different grades, different temperatures, different loads, and how it lasts. But I can tell you that the charge rate and battery degradation really is dependent on the OEM and the charge rate that they're charging at. So typically how it's rated is the C rate. So a 1C, for instance, it equates to 1 hour to fully charge a battery from 0 to 100%, regardless of the battery size. So in most applications, a lower C rate is better for the battery health. So if I'm charging at a half C rate, it means 2 hours to fully charge a battery. If I'm charging at 2 C rate, it means 30 minutes to charge. But there just really isn't enough data to see how
fast charging affects the battery health. But this is something that we are considering, and over time we will have more data on.
And then Ian, any final thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think so. We are seeing ultra fast charging on our network with the light duty passenger vehicles, albeit it is not as long as a heavy duty vehicle would take. Right, the batteries are probably a fifth of the size, but it is currently happening at 200 all the way up to 350 with a few of the vehicles, and even the Nikola vehicle, they charge up to 350 as well. And I can't say for sure that they've gotten that high, but that's what maybe Felipe can speak to that. But it is something that is currently happening. But I think Cecil really hit it on the head with, the OEM is going to set it through the BMS, the battery management system, and they're going to warranty it for that long. And so if if they're going to say it's a 10-year warranty on that battery, their systems are in place to be able to ensure that they can charge at those levels for that amount of time. And so when we advise customers on is fast charging bad or good, we really default to what the OEM says about their vehicles and the specs that they set to ensure that, if they're saying that they can do this and warranty for that long, then it should be okay.
Yeah, and to address what Ian stated about the Nikola battery electric trucks, we use a CCS1 connection, and we can connect to up to a 350 kilowatt charger today. However, our charging is limited currently to 175 kilowatts. I think we may be able to do up to 240 kilowatts. We will be rolling out an over-the-air update that will allow for these battery electric trucks to take a full 350 kilowatt charge relatively soon. And that's one of the benefits that we have. Tying back to what we were talking about in the first panel, is with these electric trucks, you're able to facilitate a lot of over-the-air updates to ensure that you're always getting the best and most up-to-date performance and capabilities out of the power electronics on the truck, whether it's the battery or the other components on the vehicle for the fuel cell truck, as well as all of the best state-of-the-art telematics and other kind of software that's embedded in the vehicle.
And I'll zoom out one more time just to be mindful of our audience and probably varying degrees of knowledge around the base. But so CCS1 would be what plugs into your vehicle as a connector type, right? So as we zoom out on the vehicle, you have a port where you are going to plug in the nozzle. CCS1 would simply be the definition of that port. There are different variations available, but what we're referencing would be the most standardized ones available on the market today. Felipe, the next question or comment as it relates, I wanted to read and maybe get some feedback from, but it's with proposed advanced clean fleet regulations passing soon, why are we discussing hydrogen as an alternative to this technology as it's not relevant for HD trucks? So I wanted to see if you had some input. There is one more there's one more segment here that they think EV trucks are more relevant and bringing hydrogen technology is confusing. So I wanted to see if you could find a way to clearly define that pathway. I believe it relates back to mileage, right? And business case scenario, but just kind of bring that comment back to a fork, maybe to use case.
Yeah, so there are a variety of OEMs out there today with hydrogen fuel cell trucks operating. I mean, Tony's tested a number of those. They're not all at commercial scale at this point or commercial production. But as an example, Hyzon has their trucks that are currently registered on the HVIP list. Hyundai is doing a demonstration project with trucks operating in the Port of Oakland. Toyota and Kenworth are partnered on a project that's operating out of the ports of LA and Long Beach. We've had our trucks, our alpha prototypes that have been in operation since the beginning of this year in commercial applications, and we expect to have our trucks commercially available within a calendar year of today. Q4 of next year. So in time for the ACF regulation going into effect, that would start to impact the ability for drayage fleets to put zero emission trucks or require them to only put zero emission trucks as new vehicles onto the drayage truck registry. For us, we see the port drayage operators as a prime market for us, and we've specifically focused on developing public fueling infrastructure that can support those drayage operations, as well as those longer routes that are going to places like the Inland Empire or the Central Valley, out of the ports to be able to facilitate those use cases that are going to be better for the fuel cell truck, or for those high duty cycle requirements that Tony was talking about in terms of slip seating trucks operating constantly within the port and requiring quick turnaround times. So all that to say, these trucks are happening a lot sooner than many people are thinking. Fuel cell trucks are right around the corner. And then as far as kind of which one goes, it's going to come down to the operational use case as far as deciding which path to go with.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Felipe. And I just want to recap and bring this back to where we started, right? Which is infrastructure project and timeline. If we hear that project timeline is roughly 1.5 to 2 years for large scale projects, then again, we can make the decision now, we can self-educate now. This isn't a walk into Best Buy and go buy these components and move through. So the timeline and the build out of new technology, I think, is very well aligned. It may be adjusting the perception of what a project looks like and the scope of it to help us. And again, I'll finalize with those two components: early engagement with your AHJs and early engagement with utilities to help set your project up for success. And with that, I wanted to pass it back to Bruce. I think we wanted to stop at 12:25. I will be mindful here. I did miss a question about on-site H2 production. It wasn't intentional, but I really wanted to focus on the fleets and electrifying and what those projects look like. So I think we might be able to answer those on a chat or later on. I wanted to focus on some of the other things. So I do apologize for missing that question. And Bruce, if you're out there, or Steve.
I am out there. Tessie, thank you so much. Absolutely fantastic. And again, panelists, and I know many of you were on from our first panel. Appreciate the double time that you did. Everybody, just fantastic job. And it's your expertise, it's your knowledge that are going to help, so many of these fleets as they transition to, zero emission vehicles. I'm going to repeat the theme of the day, and probably my and many people at CARB's theme for many, many months, if not years now: preparation, planning. Don't wait till the last minute. We've heard that so many times today. Can't stress that enough. Having said all that, again, I want to say thank you, folks.